I'm Veronica Dudo. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, crude talks. President Trump meets oil executives today, what it means for Venezuela and the economy. Potential showdown. Iran's response to nationwide protests could spur U.S. action, what that might look like. Plus, papal diplomacy. Pope Leo meets with members of the diplomatic corps, what the meeting tells us about his papacy. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us on the Feast of St. Adrian of Canterbury. Our top story tonight, President Donald Trump meets with oil executives, including from Chevron, Exxon, and ConocoPhillips, to discuss Venezuela and bringing that nation, in his words, back to life. He wants to revive the country's once thriving oil industry and control its global distribution to generate money. He says at least $100 billion will be invested by big oil, and this comes as the Trump administration seized another ship. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen.
Well, Veronica, good evening to you. President Trump said today he wants to restore Venezuela's economy and generate great wealth for both Venezuelans and Americans, and tremendous wealth for the companies going in, some of whom were seated around him at a table in the East Room.
U.S. forces board another oil tanker in the Caribbean, the Trump administration targeting sanctioned ships traveling to and from Venezuela. In a pre-dawn post on Truth Social, President Donald Trump writes, Venezuela is releasing large numbers of political prisoners as a sign of seeking peace. This is a very important and smart gesture. The USA and Venezuela are working well together, especially as it pertains to rebuilding in a much bigger, better, and more modern form their oil and gas infrastructure. The president adding there won't be another round of attacks on the South American country, but the U.S. military presence will remain in the area for safety and security.
And you'll have total safety, total security. One of the reasons you couldn't go in is you had no guarantees, you had no security, but now you have total security. It's a whole different Venezuela, and Venezuela is going to be very successful.
For now, the main focus, Venezuela's expansive reserves of petroleum, and whether oil execs are comfortable with investing in a country facing instability and inflation.
But it's tremendous reserves, among the biggest in the world. Some people say it is the biggest in the world. And we're going to be working with Venezuela. We're going to be making the decision as to which oil companies are going to go in, that we're going to allow to go in. We're going to cut a deal with the companies. We'll probably do that today or very shortly thereafter.
With Nicolas Maduro behind bars, President Trump has said there's a new opportunity to use Venezuela's oil to keep gasoline prices low. Meanwhile, Russia launching a massive overnight attack in Ukraine, using hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. The deadly attack coincides with the new chill in relations between Moscow and Washington over Venezuela, and the U.S. seizure of a Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic.
Now, as for that oil tanker seized today in the Caribbean Sea, U.S. Southern Command says there is no safe haven for criminals. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
David Luna, Executive Director of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies, joins me now. Thanks so much for coming on.
Good to be here, Veronica.
What is the current political situation in Venezuela following the U.S. removal of Nicolas Maduro?
So it's a very complex, fluid situation, obviously, with the capture of Maduro and his extradition to the United States. The interim president and the interim government continues to work with the Trump administration to ensure that there is some security and stability within the country.
The U.S. continues to take actions against oil shipments. Can you explain to our viewers more about the illicit oil market and who's involved?
So since the Chavez-Maduro regime, for 25 years, there's been various sanctions related to the oil from Venezuela. Since the U.S. intervention, President Trump has begun to ease some of those sanctions. However, there have been oil tankers that have been seized by the United States. In some cases, there have been false flags, and in recent days, we've heard about a Russian oil tanker being seized. With respect to the illicit oil, obviously it's one of the ways that the Maduro regime was able to finance its government, including through narco trafficking and other illicit crimes. Gold has been very prominent given the high prices of gold. So you've had various parts of the government partake in those illicit activities within Venezuela.
How has the U.S. mission in Venezuela impacted regional security issues for the Americas?
So the U.S. State Department has been quite active, especially during the Trump administration. I think aligned with the president's new national security strategy to make the Western Hemisphere a priority for the United States. Obviously, it's been trying to advance the president's national interests within the hemisphere. And in recent days, there's been discussion about opening up the embassy in Caracas. So I hope that those discussions continue so that American diplomats can again have a greater presence within Venezuela.
David Luna, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Leaders in Iran are threatening a crackdown on nationwide protests, leading to a possible showdown with the U.S. government. Footage shows millions of protesters on the streets as mass demonstrations have spread to more than 100 cities across the Middle Eastern country. The protest began nearly 2 weeks ago on December 28th. Then, last night, Iran cut off access to the internet and international telephone calls. So far, at least 50 people have died and more than 2,200 people have been detained. Iran's supreme leader says U.S. President Donald Trump is to blame for the unrest.
Last night in Tehran and a few other places, people came and did damage to their own buildings, ruining their own streets, in order to make the president of another country happy.
Joining us now is Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. Thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure.
So the protest began December 28th in response to crippling economic hardships. However, protesters are chanting slogans like "death to the dictator." Are these rounds of protests different, and could they be a precursor to a revolution?
That is the most important question, and I think it's the question that we don't really have an answer to. We can only conjecture, given the fact that Iran is opaque to most Western analysts and government officials. But there is a general sense that this round of protests, and Iran, of course, seems to have big uprisings every few years, but there is a sense that this round of uprising is different, if only because the Iranian economy has been so hobbled by mismanagement and sanction. The government has very little in the way of resources to try to mitigate the demands of protesters. At the same time, in the aftermath of this summer's war with Israel, the regime's credibility and legitimacy has been severely compromised. For 35 or 40 years, the Iranian regime has been telling the people of Iran how strong they are, how they could defeat the Zionists, and things along those lines. And then in 12 days, Israel, mostly, and then with the help of the United States at the very end of this conflict, revealed Iran to be extraordinarily weak. This is a toxic combination, economic hardship and the credibility of the regime deteriorating, and this has brought people out into the streets.
Iranian leadership is threatening a crackdown on protesters, and President Trump has said the U.S. is locked and loaded and ready to go should the crackdown turn violent. What actions might be taken?
Well, this is clearly very, very aggressive rhetoric on the part of the president, who has previously indicated that he did not want to get involved in uprisings and revolutions around the world. When he was president-elect, and the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad fell, the president posted on social media that it was not America's fight. I think much of what the president has said here is bluster in order to intimidate the Iranian regime, in order to get them to believe that he might, in fact, use military force to protect protesters after Operation Midnight Hammer, the bombing of Iran's nuclear program. I think that the Iranian leadership has to believe that the president is capable of everything and anything At the same time, it's hard to imagine what targets the United States would go after in the event that the regime uses more force against protesters.
So there's currently an internet blackout. How does this end? How likely is it that a peaceful resolution could happen?
Well, if you go by other uprisings and other revolutions, whenever a leadership brings the internet down and turns it off, it's clear that they are fearful of people understanding what is happening in other parts of the country, and they're fearful of support from outside of the country. So this is a real indication that the regime feels itself to be quite vulnerable. Whether this ends up a revolution and a democratic breakthrough, a military coup, or the regime prevails is very, very hard to tell. I don't think anybody who predicts any one of those outcomes is telling the truth.
Stephen Cook, thank you.
Thank you.
Minnesota officials say they want transparency after 37-year-old Renee Good was killed in an ICE-involved shooting in Minneapolis. Mayor Jacob Fry says he is deeply concerned that the Department of Justice has already reached a conclusion before a full investigation is complete. The agent, identified through records as Jonathan Ross, has been with ICE since 2015. The administration says he acted in self-defense, but local leaders argue the shooting was unnecessary. According to reports, federal sources say Good worked as a Minneapolis-based immigration activist serving as a member of ICE Watch. The investigation into the Wednesday incident continues.
So our ask is really simple here. Our ask is to embrace the truth. Our ask is to include the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension in this process because we in Minneapolis want a fair investigation.
A new video was recorded by the phone of ICE agent Jonathan Ross during the fatal shooting of Good. Federal officials maintain that the agent's life was in danger and that he acted in self-defense. Local authorities dispute that and argue that the video shows the shooting was unnecessary and avoidable. In the meantime, federal sources say Good worked as a Minneapolis-based immigration activist serving as a member of a group called ICE Watch. Tensions flared in East Portland, Oregon, as a man and woman were wounded by federal Customs and Border Protection agents during a targeted vehicle stop. Homeland Security says as ICE agents attempted to stop a car driven by Louis David Nico Moncada, he tried to run over those agents, prompting one to open fire. His wife was in the passenger seat and both were hospitalized with gunshot wounds. According to DHS, the couple is in the country illegally and linked to the Trende Aragua gang. Meanwhile, Portland's mayor condemned the incident and called for ICE to halt all operations in the city. More than a dozen House Republican lawmakers broke from President Trump and joined Democrats in passing legislation that extends Obamacare subsidies for 3 years. The action by the 17 GOP lawmakers was also a rebuke of House Speaker Mike Johnson and his leadership team. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us with the latest. Eric.
Good evening, Veronica. The latest act culminates a week of Republicans crossing party lines and voting with Democrats. A handful also voted to limit President Trump's war powers authorities in Venezuela, and many spoke out against the president wanting to control Greenland. So does this mean Republicans are eyeing November midterms rather than staying loyal to the president's agenda?
Republicans for decades have been running like little scared girls away from health care, and I think it's stupid. You say health care to a Republican, they dive out a window and go hide in a bush. Well, this should be our issue.
Wisconsin Congressman Derek Van Orden was one of the Republicans who backed the Obamacare extension, but adds Democrats set up the broken system that's badly in need of reform, something Republicans are currently working on.
I think it was just saying to their constituents, we hear you and we're not going to let your premiums skyrocket.
Is this a sign for Speaker Johnson that he really needs to address health care?
I don't know. Maybe they wanted it to happen. Maybe this was a safety fuse, a sanctioned riot.
Democrats claim Republicans are crumbling.
There are just numerous fissures that have developed in the Republican Party, and they're getting wider and wider.
It shows that tens of millions of Americans are very upset about the Republican abandonment of the healthcare interests and rights of the people.
Republicans disagree and tell me that they hope to release a bill next week with major reforms for Obamacare. The debate now shifts to the Senate, where leader John Thune is going to have to balance the priorities of GOP conservatives against the deal-seeking middle of his conference. Time is running out. Obamacare open enrollment ends in most states on January 15th. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
We have a lot more still to come on EWTN News Nightly. Words of warning. Pope Leo says war is back in vogue, but that wasn't his only concern during his address to the diplomatic corps. Plus, we have the historic procession that draws thousands to the streets in the Philippines. While meeting with members of the diplomatic corps, Pope Leo XIV warned that human rights and freedoms are under threat as diplomacy has been overshadowed by the logic of power and war. EWTN News Vatican correspondent Valentina Di Donato has more.
War is back in vogue, and a zeal for war is spreading. Peace is no longer sought as a gift and a desirable good in itself, or in the pursuit of the establishment of the ordered universe willed by God, with a more perfect form of justice among men and women. Instead, peace is sought through weapons as a condition for asserting one's own dominion.
A dire tone marked the Pope's first New Year address to members of the diplomatic corps. Ambassadors who were present tell EWTN News that despite the difficulties on the world stage, the Holy Father's message still offered hope.
The Holy Father gave us a very strong and very inspired speech, reflecting to many things happening around the globe, but at the same time very much inspired by the theology and the messages of the Holy Augustine. Still some differences, but somebody told me that the increasing of the extremist movements from any kind of the side are probably also related to the lack of the faith.
The Holy Father also reiterated the pressing need for an immediate ceasefire in the ongoing war in Ukraine, appealing that the international community not waver in its commitment to pursue a lasting solution in protecting the most vulnerable and restore hope to the afflicted people.
For us is ending the war in Ukraine that Russia is waging against a peaceful country, and making sure that the solution that is found at the end is not just peace, but it's peace that can last, that is backed up by guarantees, by economic prosperity, by freedom, and by the rule of law that the Pope has called upon us today to respect and honor everywhere.
And on the front lines of the peace effort is Holy Mother Church herself.
You know, for Ukraine, religion in general and churches, concrete churches particularly, are very important. In the Eastern and mainly in the whole Europe, this is a nation which has one of the highest rate of the religiosity right now. So messages which our population receive from the church leaders, from the parish priests, are very influential, especially in the context of the war, surely. We have the spiritual support of the population in this tragic period.
Pope Leo XIV also spoke of the importance of human fundamental rights like protecting the most vulnerable, the unborn. The practice of surrogacy, which transforms gestation into a negotiable service and reducing a child to a product. And the Orwellian style of language that is developing, that ends up excluding those who do not conform to the ideologies that are fueling it. In Rome, Valentina Di Donato for EWTN News Nightly.
In a massive display of faith, millions of barefoot devotees flooded the streets of Manila for the annual Black Nazarene procession. Chanting and scrambling to touch the centuries-old statue, many worshipers believe the wooden icon can perform miracles and cure terminal ailments. For these Filipinos, the nearly 4-mile journey is a profound act of penance and a plea for a better life. Despite the heat and a heavy security presence, the sea of maroon-clad faithful remains driven by a spirit of hope. In a display of devotion, over 3,000 pilgrims gathered at the banks of the Jordan River today to mark the baptism of Jesus Christ and to pray for health and peace across the region. This year's ceremony was commemorated as preparations begin to mark 2,000 years since the baptism of Christ. Following hymns and prayers for those suffering, worshipers were blessed with holy water and experienced spiritual renewal at the site where the Jordan flows towards the Dead Sea, a place of great importance in Christian history. Up next on EWTN News Nightly, Eucharistic Identity. Father Gregory Pine tells us about his new book on the Eucharist, how it answers today's toughest questions. Welcome back. Although the final year of the National Eucharistic Revival has come to a close, there are still ways to keep the witness of faith alive. I had the chance to speak with Father Gregory Pine, the author of a new book on the Eucharist, reflecting on the revival. Father Gregory Pine, author of Your Eucharistic Identity, a sacramental guide to the fullness of life, joins me now in studio to discuss his new book. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Father, tell us about your book.
So the inspiration was the Eucharistic Revival, and specifically the build-up to the National Eucharistic Congress, with the recognition that a lot of folks didn't quite understand the Church's teaching, but then also the power contained in that teaching. So the idea was to make it more available to folks so that way they could profit from it and grow in their spiritual lives.
So what inspired you to write the book, and what are some of the main topics that you think our viewers would be interested in?
Yeah, just kind of in my observation of media trends or the way in which people comport themselves on the internet, it seems like a lot of folks are inclined to define themselves negatively in the sense that like they know they're not this way or that way, they're not like those people or these people, but they don't necessarily know who they are. And I found that sometimes we do that in Catholic conversations, and even like with the sacraments. You'll hear it said, you know, Protestants say that the sacraments are just symbols. And so we say, oh, I guess the sacraments aren't symbols. But as it turns out, sacraments are signs of sacred things that make us holy. And so when we pay attention to them as signs, we can profit from the graces which they unleash. And so the inspiration for the book is really paying attention to the way in which the sacraments signify, to the way in which they unleash that grace in our life.
How is the fullness of life found in the gift of the Eucharist?
I mean, like the heart of the book is the fact that the only thing that Jesus really promises us is himself. Sometimes we have it in our minds that he promises us like physical health or emotional stability or psychological equilibrium. But it turns out he doesn't necessarily. He promises us spiritual abundance, which is to say he promises us his life. He promises to share with us his life. And so the Eucharist gives us his life. It nourishes us. It sustains us. It delights us with his life. And if we can learn to look for that and learn to genuinely profit from that, then that helps us to live. That's not to say that life won't be difficult. Certainly, I think most people would say that it is difficult, but it doesn't need to be unnecessarily complicated, or it doesn't necessarily need to be confusing or confounding. It can be relatively straightforward, provided that it's lived in Eucharistic intimacy.
If people want to learn more, where can they go?
So you can read the book. I mean, they can go any number of places. I think the most important place that they can go is to a local church, because there's nothing like Eucharistic presence. You know, there's no replacement for being near to the Lord. That's not to say that it's like a magic talisman, the Eucharist that is, but it is to say that the Lord wants to draw us close because it's an offer of friendship, and friends spend time, they share secrets. But you know, if you're looking for further ways in which to enrich your faith, the book is helpful. It's called Your Eucharistic Identity, a sacramental guide to the fullness of life. And that'll plug you into a variety of other resources, which are yours for the taking.
Father Gregory, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
We thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, X, YouTube, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Veronica Dudo. Good night and God bless.